People in power recognise that there's something that's really special that happens when people kind of come together and when people rise up against something that's oppressing them.
Part of the conversation about the climate crisis is about raising awareness and frequently the role of protest. In this 8-part series, Artist Ideas Now is talking to artists from Egypt and of Egyptian heritage about climate, crisis, environment, protest and change. My name is Laura Marie Brown and I'm creative producer at Liverpool Arab Arts Festival and host of this series. Miray Sidhom is an emerging theatre practitioner, combining elements of film, soundscapes, poetry and movement to create experimental and thought-provoking performances. Her theatre piece, The Bread We Break, attempts to piece together fragments from an untold history. Drawing on her Egyptian heritage, she explores Egypt's suppressed history of political uprising. It ties in with an understanding of how and why we protest and the role of protest in art. We began by talking about why bread was the starting point.
The inspiration for the show itself came from an article I read in 2017, which was about the conflict in Syria. And it was specifically focusing on the systematic bombing of bakeries by both the rebels and the government. And obviously that was causing a lot of scarcity, a lot of instability, because so many people relied on kind of subsidized bread for survival. And I think the thing that really kind of drew me to that was that the bread that was described, the bread in the photos, and the kind of the cultural significance of it for the people was so similar to the bread that I grew up with in Egypt, and kind of this connection between bread and life, which I'd been really familiar with growing up. It felt like the same thing. It was that same thing that was kind of being threatened and being used as a tool for power and control over the people. So yeah, bread became very important to me at that point, but I didn't quite know where it was going yet. And I kind of started thinking about the chants for bread, freedom and social justice that were happening around the time of the 2011 revolution and the Arab Spring. And kind of this connection between bread as being such a survival, a symbol of survival for kind of so many people that were living below poverty lines, and that becoming politicized and kind of what happens when that's threatened or when that's taken away. And it is kind of the idea of that being enough to start a revolution. So I started kind of looking more into revolutions and protests and social movements that were around bread. And at first I was kind of looking at it on a global scale and kind of like the bread riots of Brooklyn and loads of different places. And then I kind of thought I need to narrow it down a bit. And so I kind of just started focusing on political protests that were bread related in Egypt. And that proved to be really fruitful, to be honest. There was the first workers' strike in recorded history was at Dar el Medina in Veronica era, and it was over workers not being paid their grain. So that kind of felt really like significant that it was kind of this first protest, and the history of protest being as old as the history of grain, and kind of that became kind of the initial seed for the show, if you will. And it kind of had this revolution in it, which was symbolized by grain as kind of like the seed of revolution. And then it had the bread riots of 77, which took place in Cairo during Anwar al-Sadat's reign. And that was again to do with kind of subsidized bread being taken away. And it started this kind of spontaneous protest which kind of lasted for a few days and was very violent, but in the end they got what they asked for. And the third protest was the 2011 revolution. So yeah, it was kind of just making the link between kind of moments of political uprising and bread being at the centre of it, and something that's kind of so simple and everyday, but that's so kind of like filled with potential for change.
And you weave this in with, conversations with your mother as well. How did the two of those things kind of sit together in your mind?
So I kind of felt like I had to talk to my mum about it, because I feel like she's the missing link between me and Egypt, because I moved from there when I was 9, and she's kind of the closest thing I've got to someone who's lived through that experience. But also we have kind of very different political opinions on a lot of things. So it kind of felt like something that I had to do was to talk to her about it and see what her perspective on it was, and what her experience of it was. And also it kind of felt like making, like kind of repairing what could have been a broken connection between me and my mom, or between me and Egypt, by kind of talking about things that we'd never talked about before, but things that we clearly both care about. And kind of what came out of it was something that I wasn't expecting, because even though she does hold quite a lot of kind of conservative views, she's still obviously kind of really, really upset by the poverty that goes on in Egypt and the disparity in Egypt, and kind of hearing it through her words of kind of like, yeah, of the poorest people in the country who can't afford to survive, having something as essential as bread taken away from them. And kind of that obviously affected her a lot as well. That was kind of a really important conversation to have. And there's a lot of stuff that we spoke about that didn't make it into the show, but that still kind of influenced my understanding of kind of what was going on in Egypt at that time, because I must have been about 12 during the 2011 revolution. But obviously my mom was kind of speaking to family there on the phone all the time, and she had kind of much closer understanding of what was going on.
Why did you want a UK audience to hear about this as well? Because it's a history of protest in Egypt, but it's presented for a UK audience. Why did you think it was important for them to learn this history?
I think it was kind of the way that history hadn't been told to me, either in Egypt or in England, to be honest, and kind of discovering this history and feeling that it was really significant, not just to an Egyptian audience, but to a UK one as well, purely because there's always been this fascination with Egyptian culture, and we're always like so ready to delve into anything about the ancient Egyptians, even though we kind of just skip over the chapter where it was the kind of the first protest in written history. But yeah, as a culture and as a history, we're very fascinated by it. But that's just for some reason been something that we haven't been taught about or haven't looked into. And yeah, I think I've felt very disconnected from Egyptian history as someone who is a migrant living in the UK. And so kind of having that chance to share that and share this element of it that maybe you wouldn't necessarily kind of think about Egypt being kind of a revolutionary place. And a lot of the time we're kind of taught to kind of look at uprisings and social movements as being like a Western thing, a thing of the Western world. And so kind of seeing that Egypt had this rich history of kind of organised political protests, and kind of sharing that with a British audience felt quite kind of significant.
It's interesting actually, because hearing you talk about that, with a Manchester accent and being from Manchester, that sense of Manchester being the place that has the UK's, museum of people's history, and being a place where there has been uprising and revolution from the streets going right to the doors of power. There's a really nice interconnection there as well.
Yeah, I definitely agree, and it does make me feel so close to these movements when you have kind of stood in protests in Manchester, and you kind of see the same thing happening in Egypt, and you think kind of wherever in the world you are and whatever it is that you're kind of protesting against, there's something about kind of people coming together and standing up for something that they kind of believe is an injustice. And kind of experiencing it both, when I went to Egypt around that time, and both in Manchester, felt, it feels like a very similar thing wherever you are.
You talk in the show as well about government action around protest, and the right to protest and how protest takes place is something that we talk about in this country a lot. Why did you want to include that into the piece, and into a piece that focuses on protest in Egypt?
So I think at the time when the show was kind of in its final stage before being finished, that was kind of when the policing bill was being discussed a lot in the House of Lords and going between the House of Lords and the House of Commons. So it kind of felt like we had to mention it, really, just because the piece was about protest and kind of being in the country at that time when that was being taken away. That felt like something that we had to kind of speak up against. It also felt like it would be empowering for the audience to kind of, at this time when everything's so unstable and when we don't know kind of what the rules are around what you're allowed to do and what you're not, and when kind of your voice feels like it's being taken away in that sense, to kind of be presented with this history that shows that actually kind of protests and political uprisings have kind of been around since forever, and they are kind of part of our nature and in the way that we respond to a broken system, rather than kind of something that's just an act that we're allowed to do, but just like a rich part of our history as people. And then so kind of to present them with that, and then to be like, but it's not, they're not treating it as if it is our right, they're treating it as if it's a privilege to be able to go out and protest when it's not. And so kind of framing it like that and basically saying to the audience kind of like, what are you going to do about it? Because kind of we can't just kind of sit back and let kind of our voice and our ability to express ourselves be under threat. And I feel like the reason it is under threat is because people in power recognise that there's something that's really special that happens when people kind of come together and when people rise up against something that's oppressing them. And it is because of the power of that they kind of don't want people doing it.
When we bring it back to the climate crisis as well, because, when we talk about how we protest around climate justice, around the kind of raising of that profile, it does feel like a generational divide as well. And the sense of urgency is different, even though the impact is pretty evenly felt across the generations, or will be evenly felt across the generations. The desire to protest and the inclination to protest is different in different generations. How do you feel as a younger artist? Does that feel as though you have a greater responsibility to talk about that and the need to protest around the climate crisis and raise the profile of what needs to be done?
I think yes. Yes, I personally do feel that responsibility, and I think a lot of artists feel it, that are kind of my generation and younger. And that kind of goes across whether your work is kind of directly responding to climate change or kind of whether it's completely unrelated. It's always kind of part of the work that we make, and kind of sustainability of the work is always going to be a big factor in it. And it's really kind of quite hard to to ignore it in any element. But also I feel like I don't think it is our responsibility as artists. I think it's kind of the responsibility of corporations that work with fossil fuels, and kind of if we can kind of raise awareness of kind of directing them to be kind of held accountable and think more about it, and to embed that in their ways of working. I think that is the main thing, because I think kind of as artists, we're not the problem, but we are trying to be part of the solution. And so kind of to get the people that are kind of causing or contributing a lot to climate change, to get them to implement change is something that's really important, and kind of a good way for us to go about it.
In the performance, you kind of repeat, we need more revolution. What does that look like for you?
So I think in the context of the show, it was very much about how kind of small acts of change can accumulate and can bring about a sort of slow revolution. And it was kind of addressing that the 2011 revolution was 10 years ago, and we're still kind of seeing small changes that are happening in that sense. So I think my call for more revolution in the show is kind of this gradual change, and on like a personal level, kind of what can I do today, whether it's having like an awkward conversation with a family member who doesn't share your beliefs, or whether it's kind of going out of your way to address a particular subject in a context where it wouldn't usually be spoken about, or kind of organising kind of movements and get-togethers and reaching out to the community. So it is kind of, about the transformative power of kind of small acts of change and of coming together. I mean, in an ideal world, there would be kind of a fast, effective revolution that would fix everything. But unfortunately, I don't really think that's the way it's going to go.
Artists' Ideas Now is produced by Liverpool Arab Arts Festival in collaboration with Artists on the Front Line. This series was supported by The Space and Arts Council England, with funding from the National Lottery. The producers are Laura Marie Brown and Zoe Lafferty. Executive producer is Sarah Fortescue. The series music is by Yara McAway and is called Feed on Wasted Energy from her LP 1963. For more information on this series and to find out more about each of the artists featured, go to arabartsfestival.com and explore the reading list for each episode.